Imagine standing right now on a narrow street in London called Lombard Street in the year 1913. This single street controlled more than 40% of the world's money at the time. British banks managed over $10 billion in assets, which today would be worth more than $300 billion. One empire controlled trade routes from India to Canada, from Egypt to Australia. More than 450 million people lived under the British flag, and the British pound was used in over 60% of global transactions. Any merchant in Shanghai, Cairo, or Buenos Aires knew its value without asking. But less than 40 years later, by 1950, this power was fading silently. Britain emerged from World War II with debts exceeding $21 billion. Its factories were running at less than half capacity, while American factories in Detroit, California, and Texas were producing more than all of Europe combined. And in one of the most dangerous decisions in its history, Britain tried to pretend nothing had changed. In 1925, Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, decided to return the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war value, even though the economy was nearly 30% weaker. This single move made British exports 15 to 20% more expensive. Overnight, companies began collapsing in Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. Within 10 years, more than 5,000 industrial firms closed, and over 1 million workers lost their jobs. Yet the government continued acting as if everything was fine. Now, fast forward to Wall Street in New York in 2025, where more than $7 trillion move through financial markets every single day. The United States controls the largest financial system in human history. The dollar represents over 58% of global foreign reserves. America's national debt has surpassed $34 trillion, which means more than $130,000 for every single citizen. A child born today in Texas, Florida, or California is already carrying that financial burden from day one. And yet, government spending keeps rising. In just 1 year, the federal deficit exceeded $1.7 trillion, most of it funded through borrowing and money creation. China, Japan, Europe, and Gulf sovereign funds together hold more than $7 trillion in U.S. debt, which means American power is no longer built only inside its borders, but on global trust. But what happens if that trust begins to fade? It already is. In recent years, China has reduced its dependence on the dollar in trade with Russia, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia. Multi-billion-dollar agreements are now settled in local currencies. In 2023 alone, more than 25% of Chinese trade was conducted outside the dollar system, compared to just 5% a decade earlier. At the same time, Beijing is investing over $1.5 trillion in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe through the Belt and Road Initiative, while the United States spends hundreds of billions on overseas conflicts with little direct economic return. This mirrors what happened to Britain when it exhausted itself maintaining an empire while Germany and America built the factories of the future. In 1900, Britain produced 25% of the world's industrial goods. By 1950, that number had fallen below 10%. Today, the same pattern is emerging. In 1980, the United States accounted for over 30% of global manufacturing. Now it is below 16%, while China exceeds 28% and has become the world's factory, from smartphones to electric vehicles to solar panels. Even companies like Tesla rely on supply chains stretching thousands of miles across Asia. The irony is that Britain once believed financial dominance could replace industrial strength, just like many Americans believe Wall Street and Silicon Valley can permanently replace factories and skilled labor. But history shows that money alone cannot sustain an empire. In 1947, Britain had to beg the United States for a $3.75 billion loan under humiliating conditions. In 1976, it had to seek help from the International Monetary Fund for the first time in modern history. Today, analysts ask whether America could face a similar moment if debt continues rising toward $45 or even $50 trillion within the next decade. Imagine a government paying over $1 trillion every year just in interest without building a single school, hospital, or highway. That scenario is no longer science fiction. It is a realistic projection, according to U.S. Treasury data. The real lesson here is not that America will collapse tomorrow or next year. Empires do not die suddenly. They fade slowly while their citizens believe they're still on top. Britain still had ships, banks, and influence in the 1940s, but it had already lost the foundation of its power, which was long-term production, innovation, and self-sufficiency. If the United States wants to avoid the same fate, it must reinvest in education, engineering, manufacturing, energy, and infrastructure instead of relying on debt and financial speculation. Because history forgives nations that live on past glory, and the future offers no unlimited second chances. In the end, the question is not whether America is repeating Britain's mistake. The question is when it will decide to learn from it, before it is too late.